Welcome back everybody to Ingram Orchids and More. I'm Tristan, and today is a wet and dreary day, and what better day to do a little bit about a little chit chat about 10 things that I've learned over the years to grow healthy orchids. And so this is going to be a real just informal talk. Everything I'm mentioning is going to be, these are my opinions, and they're based on my experiences. Everybody has different experiences, so everyone's going to have different opinions, and what works for me doesn't always work for everybody else, so I just want to throw that out there. But I do want to just use this time just to go over just 10 things that I think will help to grow, or at least help you and others just grow healthy orchids. So the first thing I want to talk about is patience. So to grow orchids, you really have to be patient. In life, it's a good thing to be a patient person anyways. You have long-suffering patience, and that really goes well with growing orchids as well, because orchids are slow growing plants. These are not annuals, they're perennial herbs, and most of them take many years to grow to, at least if you're starting from small plants, they take a long time to get to nice mature plants. And so a lot of times, having a small plant, you're not going to expect to see major results within a year. Within a year's time you should see some results, but orchids are slow to respond to good stimuli and slow to respond most of the time to bad stimuli as well. And so the first thing that I noticed when I got into growing orchids was just how long it takes to see the benefits or get the rewards from your efforts. So if you start off with growing all seedlings, that's great, but I wouldn't encourage new orchid growers to start off with seedlings, and for a few reasons. I think seedlings, are inherently more difficult than if you start off with a blooming sized plant. Orchids can be really tricky to get right when you've only ever grown other things, and so if you start off with a seedling and you kill it right away, it can be a little discouraging. So I recommend getting a larger, more established plant, and a lot of people are going to get a fail for their first orchid anyways, and those are always going to be blooming sized plants when you buy them or you get them as gifts or whatever. So patience, you got to have patience, because orchids tend to be slow growing, and that's going to be the key to being successful. Is you have to wait and know and plan ahead, knowing that if you're buying this plant, it may be 3-4 years before you see the rewards of your efforts. Not always. Some of them do surprise you and they end up being really rewarding plants, and a lot of them there's great hybrids and stuff that grow pretty quickly, but for all intents and purposes, most orchids are pretty slow growing. So that's the first thing I would say, is you need to be patient. Orchids that will work in your environment. So if you're new to growing orchids, you probably want to start off by finding orchids that grow well either where you're at or where you're planning on growing them. So me being in South Florida, we grow a lot of Cattleya, dendrobiums. We grow a lot of things, but my first orchids were probably, I think the first orchid I got was a Phalaenopsis, and then after that I went to cheap bag babies, and at Home Depots and Lowe's you can get those better grow plants, and those oftentimes tend to be either Cattleya or Cattleya relatives. You can get Vandas, Encyclias, Oncidiums, all sorts of stuff in the bag babies, but I think I stuck with a Cattleya. And Cattleyas are great for Florida because they like the heat and they don't mind a little bit of cool either. So if you're someone who's living up north and you have to grow inside, maybe your first orchids that you're going to start growing are, let's say, something more intermediate like Oncidium or Miltoniopsis. Something that's a little bit more intermediate, because you're probably going to be growing in an inside setting where temperatures are going to be more consistent. So something that that likes a little bit more, around 70-74 degrees or whatever your inside air temperature is, and then just adjust your lighting accordingly. And that doesn't mean that you can't grow hot growing stuff, but I think for people who are getting into this, you should probably start with something that's a little easier first, and it's going to work well with you first, and then venture out and see push the limits of what you can grow. and I've pushed my limits here on what I can grow. I found there's certain plants that I just cannot grow, and that's okay. So eventually, you're gonna try new things and they're not gonna work out, and you're gonna ask yourself, was it something I did, or did I just get unlucky? Sometimes you may have done something wrong. You could have given the plant what it did not want and it just perished. But oftentimes, I'll try once or twice at least, and after the second or third time, if it's not working out, I just kind of give up and move on to a different plant, or either try it, plan to, in the future, if I'm going to try a certain species or hybrid again, I know that's going to be difficult. I have a plan in the future to make that succeed. Next thing I think that I want to talk about is light. So a lot of orchids will tolerate a lot of temperatures, but getting the light right can be a big key between growing them successfully and not growing them successfully, or subpar, not to the standards that you have for the plant. And a lot of people think, or it's like Phalaenopsis, they don't tend to like a lot of bright light. They want bright indirect light most of the time. There's always exceptions, but people think that different amounts of shade different people have different opinions about what bright shade is. And so a lot of times you can read up about how many foot candles or how many lumens light they like, and you also kind of have to figure out, do they like that intensity of light all day long, or is it morning? Do they like their higher amount of light in the mornings when the temperatures are cooler? And another thing is, what genre or what specific plants will grow in full sun, which there aren't many, but there are some. And what plants will grow in shifting shade that goes from direct sunlight to some dappled shade to direct sunlight, and also what will not take any sunlight. I find a lot of the species Phalaenopsis, some of the Rhynchostylus will burn in really bright direct light, but you have to figure out what lighting situation works for what orchids, and it can take some getting used to. And eventually you'll get the idea of it, and you'll kind of be able to guess. But it's still a trial and error thing. So when you get a new plant, you may put it in a certain location that gets a lot of light, and you're finding that it's getting too much light. The leaves are blanching; they're turning a little bit white at the beginning. So maybe you back it off, and it's just trial. A lot of orchids can also be adjusted to take higher light. It just needs to be done slower. So especially with nursery grown products. So a lot of times orchid nurseries will be growing, they don't have the luxury to move plants around. A lot of times they'll have shade houses with either like 50% shade, 70% shade, or even 90% shade, and some of them less, like 30 or 40% shade. And so a lot of times their plants are all treated the same when it comes to light, because that's what they have to do for nursery grown plants. So just because you buy a Laelia undulata or a Schomburgkia from a nursery, and that those plants, people grow them successfully in full sun, you need to keep in mind that those plants probably weren't grown in full sun. Well, they might have, but know if the plants were grown in a greenhouse environment, because then you need to adjust those plants slowly to start taking the max amount of light that they will tolerate. And that's another thing. Oftentimes orchids will bloom and grow the best when you grow them just about as bright as they'll tolerate without burning or stressing the plants out. The plants that are grown in too much shade tend to not, usually they'll grow fine, they just don't bloom as well. So that's another thing, is you have to learn, not all orchids are the same. Some of them like different amounts of light during the day, and you should also remember to carefully push your plants to as bright of a location as they can tolerate without hurting them. So temperatures, you got to know what your temperature range is going to be in your growing environment, or either if you're growing inside in like a terrarium or a greenhouse, adjust your temperatures accordingly, because when we were talking about light, a lot of plants that will take full sun, they may take full sun at 70 degrees, but when it gets into the 90s, a lot of orchids will just scorch, they'll burn. So you have to know how hot the foliage is getting, how hot the plants can take. especially if it's a lighter a thing where they're taking some direct sun. The foliage temperature, gets above 100 and something degrees, they're going to start burning. So people who grow in more intermediate conditions can probably get something to take full sun. If their daytime temperatures aren't exceeding 80 degrees, the plants may be growing just fine in full sun, because the foliar temperature may not be getting, not getting to the point where cells start, collapsing and scorching and burning. So you got to keep that in mind, especially for us Florida growers, because we have such hot summers. And it's so many times I've gone out, I have a plant that's been growing in full sun all year long. We have a real hot, bright day where there's like not a lot of UV protection in the atmosphere, and that it's really, really intense light, and it's almost 100 degrees. Then you go out and the plant's just scorched because the plant couldn't handle it. Whereas it was growing well in full sun the rest of the year when temperatures were a little bit lower. So that's another thing you need to keep in mind when starting out, is your temperature ranges. All right, what's next? Growing media. Growing media, this is it can be a real opinionated topic. Everybody is going to tell you that, oh, you should only grow your plants in this. And I have some strong opinions myself. But the thing about growing media, if you're growing, this mostly applies to potted plants. If you're growing in a media that works well for you and you're getting good results, that's all you need. But that being said, you will find, if you're starting out, you'll find that there are certain medias that you'll want to try, and you'll hear other people say they're really good and you'll want to try them, and they may or may not work. So it's all about you, your plants, and your conditions, and how well you water, or what your watering habits are. So I like to grow in lava rock because we get torrential downpours here in Florida, and everything I grow is outside. So a lot of my drier growing stuff I'll grow in red lava rock. That way there's nothing that can break down. Most of the orchids seem to like it. They root well into the rock. There's nothing wrong with bark mix. A good bark mix that's broken up with perlite, charcoal, the little leca balls. Some people like to grow in just leca balls, or hydroton is a brand name. You'll hear them called expanded clay pellets, those little clay balls. Those work really well. Just like lava rock, it's not going to break down, but I don't like it as much because I find it to be hard to pot with. The balls don't pack together very tightly. You can only get so tight around the root system, and then the plants tend to fall out, or you have to stake them up, and I don't like to stake plants. So I like the lava rock because it stays together. It's a little bit more irregular shaped and holds together. But I also grow in bark mix. I also grow certain things in sphagnum moss. I grow a lot of things in shredded tree fern. You'll hear me rant and rave about it. That's my strong opinion. I tend to think that shredded tree fern is a great material, but it may not work for everybody. And so you're going to have to find out yourself what works for you and your conditions. And so just because somebody tells you, oh, you should never grow any orchids in sphagnum moss, I tend to hear that and I think, you probably haven't been growing orchids long enough, because eventually you'll find a plant like certain bulbophyllums that they need so much water that you're like, try everything and it doesn't work, and then you try sphagnum moss, the plant grows perfectly. So there's plants that there's a use for sphagnum moss, even though people will hate on it so much. So you got to know what works for what plants, what works in your environment. So it's not bad to experiment around. Don't experiment trying moving all of your orchid collection into one type of media. Especially because if you find out you don't like it, or if it doesn't work well with your plants and you kill all your plants, you're going to be real upset. So try moving a few different plants into different media types, and put them side by side. These orchids are expensive, and sometimes it's daunting to try and experiment with your expensive nice plants. But just do a few small plants here and there and just see what works for you. And media, when it comes to media, the big thing is that you're creating a healthy rooting environment for your root system. And if it's hostile to orchid root growth, it's not going to work well for you in the first place. So you also need to make sure your media that you're potting in is clean. So if you're using like low grade, dirty sphagnum moss, there's a lot of sphagnum moss out there that may work as a potting amendment for other type of plants. but does not meet the standards that you would want for orchids. It's just too full of other pathogens. It's already broken down. So just make sure your media, whatever you're getting, make sure it's good quality, and make sure it's clean too. So then make sure you're storing your media when you're not using it before you pot it. Make sure you're storing it somewhere that it's not going to get, you know, disgusting and filled with contaminants. Culture and disease. There's a lot of disease problems you'll hear about, and people tend to immediately run to the chemicals, but the thing that I've learned is the best way to prevent pests and diseases in your orchid collection is good culture. And for the most part, that's going to include things like growing them in well lit, you know, growing your plants as bright as they'll take, good sunlight, not too much, but you know, just what they'll take, good air movement. You gotta have good air movement. If you don't have good air movement, and you have a damp, let's say you just water and there's no good air movement around your plants, that's a breeding ground for like bacterial and fungal spores to start germinating. And a lot of our plants that we grow are epiphytic, so a lot of these are going to be up in the treetops or in branches where there may not be heavy winds, but there's going to be air moving, and so there's going to be lots of breezes and stuff that's going to, you know, keep the air moving around the plants so that these bacteria and fungi don't get a foothold. And we're not growing in nature anyways. These plants don't have the benefit of being in their natural environment. So you want to make sure you got good air movement, a good clean work area. Make sure your growing area is clean too. Don't let that one's a real tricky one, especially if you grow outside like us. Don't let too many weeds get a hold of. That's me calling the kettle black, because I got a lot of weeds growing in my pots. But make sure your growing environment is, you know, not conducive to disease pressure. An ounce of good culture is worth, you know, a ton of chemical use. So just keep that in mind, because if you take care of the culture, a lot of times the disease and pest problems will stay to a minimum. So if you're like me and you really love the idea of growing species, orchids just the way that you find them in nature, or you really like species versus hybrids, you need to know that your plants are probably going to be growing a lot slower than a lot of these hybrids. Not always. There's exceptions to every rule. There's some species that do grow really nicely and really quickly. But most of the time, species orchids are going to be a little bit less forgiving and a little bit slower growing than like some of these complex hybrids. A lot of these complex hybrids have been, you know, they've been selected, the parents have been selected to be beautiful, easy growing, fast growing, bloom multiple times a year, resist pest and disease. A lot of hybridizers at nurseries and stuff, they'll cull the runts. So when they're growing new seedlings, anything that doesn't, they'll naturally die off the week, or they'll be picked off. And so you'll end up with line bred hybrids that have, you know, the best of the best have been picked. And a lot of times they have hybrid vigor, because they're getting the genetic material from multiple different species. And so oftentimes they are able to, you know, grow in multiple, or a wide range of conditions. And so they tend to be more forgiving than species. Species tend to be very climate and environment specific. They don't like too big of a change versus their natural environment. So just keep that in mind. If you're new, I would recommend starting off with some of the primary hybrids first, and then if you're still interested in species, then work your way to species. So if you start off with primary hybrids, you're not going to end up with something that's too crazy hybridized, but it'll be easier to grow than a lot of species. Water quality. So you're going to hear people say that water's not that important, it's just remembering to water them. And then you'll hear people that'll say you absolutely don't want to use tap water ever, it's a bad thing, only use the best of the best. And you know, my opinion, I fall somewhere right in the middle. I think water quality is pretty important. And it's more so important if you've got bad quality water. If you've got bad quality water, that's going to make a huge difference to your growing experience. So what do I mean by bad quality water? Water that's really high in dissolved solids, and has a high electrical conductivity because there might be salts in the water. That's usually a recipe for disaster. So a lot of commercial growers will either have well water that's really nice, they'll either collect their rainwater, because rain tends to be pretty pure. It's got a little bit of dissolved nitrogen and dissolved CO2, so it's slightly acidic. And rain is what the plants naturally get. So rain is an excellent source of water as long as you keep it clean. And real sidetrack real quick, most orchids do like it in acidic media, slightly acidic. Not very acidic, but just slightly. Rainfall tends to be slightly on the acidic side, and the growing media tends to be, or the substrate that they grow on does tend to be slightly acidic, because it's usually high in organic material. And so a pH range around 5 to 6 is usually perfect for orchids. So when rainfall tends to fall in that. Another thing is people use reverse osmosis water. Reverse osmosis water is basically pure water, and oftentimes it's either slightly acidic or neutral, and that's perfectly fine. People get into these rants about tap water because certain municipalities, certain areas, they'll have really high chlorine count, or for human safety, so that we don't get sick, or they'll have real high amounts of stuff like sulfur or calcium or magnesium. And you're saying calcium, magnesium, what's wrong with that? Those are the plants need those things, and yes, they do. But if your water is already full of so much, you've got so many ions in your water, there's not a lot of room for any other nutrients to be added into your water, and you can start burning your root tips when you have too much stuff that's in the water, because as the water sits on the roots and it evaporates, it's going to leave behind a lot of precipitated elements, or precipitated salts, or chemicals that are going to sit on the roots, and you can burn your roots that way. So as long as you've got really fairly good water quality from your tap, it's usually fine. But if you're in an area and your chlorine's really high, or your dissolved solids are really high, maybe you consider watering with distilled water, or get a reverse osmosis machine, or collect your rainfall. Just make sure you filter it so it doesn't get super yucky. And if you have the means to get a full RO machine or something to water your whole collections, then good for you, because that's awesome. A lot of nurseries do that. Good quality water can make a big difference when you're growing a lot of plants. So this is number 10, I think, the last thing on my list. So to grow healthy orchids, grow healthy roots. So you want to get all your light, your watering, all that right, but to grow a healthy plant, you got to have a healthy root system. And so growing roots is probably going to be the most important thing. And you'll notice that a lot of that ties into your water, your media, how you're watering, those sort of things. So take care to grow good roots. Make sure you've got a stable pot. When you repot, you want to damage as little roots as possible, unless you have an infection going on. You have to clip roots, or you're doing bare root divisions, that's fine. But if you can grow healthy roots, oftentimes the plant will follow. If you don't, you can have the best light setup, the best fertilizer, you can have all that stuff right, and if you can't grow roots, or you got a poor root system on a plant, the plant's just going to suffer. You're not going to get good results, because roots are the life of the plant. That's where they take in their water and their nutrients, and they're what anchor the plant. So you have to take care to grow good roots first, before you do anything else. So certain orchids, you'll notice, just resent their roots being disturbed, and it can be the downfall of the plant if you mess up their root systems. So that means that you plan far ahead. If you know you're going to be somewhere where you're going to have a lot of water, maybe you skip the bark mix, so you don't have to go damaging the roots in 2 years when you repot it. Maybe you stick with something inorganic, like a rock or hydroton or the clay pebbles, so that you could just up pot without having to go and hack at the old root system when you repot. That way you don't damage the roots. And Vandas, you really got to take care of your roots, because they're long-lived roots. Vanda roots can live for years and years and years, whereas Cattleyas, it's a rhizome. The roots emerge and new flushes out of the new growth every time a new growth develops, and so eventually those old roots are going to die off anyway, and you can cut them away, and the plant will do just fine, because you can just grow new roots when the new growth develops. But with like Vandas, it's a stem, and they do have older roots too, but oftentimes those roots will branch and branch and branch, and some vandas only make a few roots out of each side of the stem, a couple times a year. And if you damage the main section of the root coming out of the plant, you can really set the plant back. So you got to keep those things in mind, and take care to fertilize correctly. Don't over fertilize your plants, because you can burn your roots that way. Use good quality water. Don't let bugs get into your root system and start munching on it. Don't let disease get a foothold. Stuff like Phytophthora, those tend to be root or rhizoc or fusarium. Those diseases get a foothold in the root system, and then they spread to the rest of the plant, and it's game over. A lot of those pathogens are root pathogens first, before they move into the rest of the vascular tissues of the plant. So take care to grow good roots, take care of your root system, and a lot of times the plants will take care of themselves. Not always, there's exceptions, but grow your roots first, then worry about the rest of the plant. That being said, I'm soaked, I'm undercover here, but I'm getting rained on pretty heavy, so I hope y'all learned a little something. This is just a little rant that I wanted to do. Got any extra opinions you want to add in the comments? Feel free to do so. Like I said, this is just my opinions and based on my experiences. These are not facts. So a lot of orchid growing there's no hard, fast rules. It's dynamic. You can have different opinions and still be a good orchid grower. So if y'all got any opinions you want to add in the comments, feel free to do so. And one last tip for growing healthy orchids. The 11th thing that you should do to grow healthy orchids is subscribe to our channel. So if you like what you saw, hit like, share, and subscribe. That was pretty cringy, I apologize. But we'll see you next time, guys, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye.